Welcome back to the course Cooperative Individualism, the third way to the just society. We are at lesson 12. The title of this lesson is Restructuring Government to Meet Our Needs. History and experience have demonstrated that participatory government, particularly when decentrally structured, is inherently more likely to yield a higher degree of equality of opportunity and liberty than any other form. We need to objectively examine what method of government best meets our needs and move in that direction. Yet even within those societies considered highly democratic in nature, there exists a considerable degree of frustration over the role played by government at all levels. Citizens generally feel left out of the process and unable to influence the actions taken by quasi-permanent bureaucracies, particularly at levels other than local or municipal. Too often, only a small percentage of those eligible to vote in elections make the effort, unless required by law to do so, and an even smaller number are active in community affairs. To be sure, we have a right to expect those employed by or elected to government to make sure the public sector fulfills its responsibilities. Unfortunately, time and experience have proven that the present constitution of government interferes with this objective. What is needed to more fully realize the promise of democracy is to take the debate over solutions to a sustained, higher level that focuses not simply or primarily on short-run remedial measures, but looks at the fundamental construction of our socio-political arrangements and institutions. Discussion of government today most often focuses on issues. We ask how government can mitigate the social and economic problems that plague our societies. The interest of those in government is to maintain this focus and to discourage measures designed to alter the structure within which government functions. Those individuals within government who advance proposals for systemic reform or restructuring are too often viewed by their colleagues or superiors not as citizens to be praised, but as whistleblowers. To be fair, this conflict between those who bring to any job a high level of motivation and principle-based behavior and those who do not is not limited to government. Those who are comfortable in their circumstance or who benefit by the status quo will often strenuously resist even obviously necessary changes. Their power to do so, individually and collectively, may be great or small. Many times, only a severe shock to the system opens a window of opportunity for those who desire to effect systemic improvements. Putting aside for the moment the structural changes needed in the private sector, there are very specific changes that will materially improve the performance of government at all levels. The first objective should be to expand the degree of citizen participation in the governing process. In communities throughout much of the world where authoritarian regimes are not an obstacle, citizens do come together in civic and neighborhood associations, foundations, or as members of political parties. A much smaller number are active in volunteer, environmental, or other public interest groups. For many citizens in the United States and other countries, however, even the fundamental civic responsibility of voting for elected officials is ignored, for reasons that include apathy, disgust, a sense of isolation, and the challenge of simply earning a living. Many citizens do not participate. Before this situation can be reversed, we must recognize what the obstacles are and take action to remove them. In elections in many countries, the unfortunate reality is that a majority of a minority of citizens determine who is elected. In the United States, for example, far less than half of the eligible citizens bother to register to vote in most districts. Registering requires the citizen to be proactive rather than reactive. Now that computerized databases can be economically maintained, other methods of securing voter registrations are being implemented but are challenged for reasons both justified and not. A registration form could automatically be sent to anyone who is in the database but did not vote in the previous election or has otherwise lost eligibility. Registration by telephone should be considered, with each citizen assigned a security number entered over a digital phone. A natural extension of this process is to permit voting by telephone or computer for those individuals who work outside of the communities in which they reside or who cannot conveniently visit a voting location. Another possibility is to place election ballots within a bulletin board on a personal computer network for those who have access to a personal computer connected to the voting location by modem. Computerized voting stations could be installed in numerous locations so that citizens could vote wherever they might be, regardless of where they actually reside. Our systems of positive law have evolved as powerful means of distributing privilege, and to the extent this side of law is effective, liberty and equality of opportunity are thwarted. Even under the best of circumstances, where positive law was built on truly just principles, there would still be disagreement over the degree to which government versus private initiative should be relied upon to advance public policy. The approach to schooling of children is but one area where disagreement exists. The practical need to influence public opinion suggests that political parties will be resorted to for a long time to come. At issue is whether the general citizenry, who have no day-to-day involvement in party affairs, should continue to be empowered to select the party candidates for office by virtue of their party registration and voting in what in the United States are called primary elections. If in fact our political parties are to be organizations of individuals joined together to advance a philosophically driven policy agenda, allowing otherwise uninvolved citizens to determine a party's candidates dilutes the purpose of the party. Political parties ought to be democratically structured, but only those individuals who have contributed either their time, energy, or financial resources should be considered members of the party and eligible to select candidates for office. The requirements for party membership should be left to the party members to determine. Excessively stringent requirements would, of course, virtually assure the party a place in permanent obscurity. The right of the citizen to vote for public officials is appropriately limited to the general election, where all party candidates and their programs are weighed one against the other. Under this type of system, the candidates are more appropriately the representatives of their parties, and what they stand for can be more consistently relied upon as the agenda they will pursue and support if elected. Another important issue is whether individuals should be permitted to succeed themselves in office, and if so, how many times. On the side of providing for unlimited terms of office is the right of citizens to select whomever they wish to represent their interests. Against this position is the advantage of incumbency in elections and the concentration of political power into the hands of a relatively small number of entrenched individuals. Tocqueville observed that one of the main safeguards of American democracy was the frequency of elections, implying that frequent elections inherently limit the concentration of power. Experience suggests that when frequency of elections is combined with unlimited potential for re-election, representative government is diminished in no small part by the amount of time and financial resources devoted to campaigning. What then are the options to be considered for a cleansing of this process and broadening of the democracy? In the complexity of our modern world, serving as an elected official requires an individual's undivided attention, and there is a rather long learning curve before one becomes adequately informed on legislation under consideration. Under these circumstances, a term of office of 4 years seems to be a reasonable compromise. Beyond the local and municipal levels of government, we ought to consider setting terms in the legislature at 6 years, but limit individuals to 2 successive terms in office. A 12-year period within which to affect the direction of governmental programs is long enough to encourage continuity while reducing the amount of energy and financial resources devoted to gaining elected office. When combined with changes in how candidates are selected, the actual election campaign period can be shortened to no more than a few months. The public can protect itself from serious misrepresentation by the recall process. At the far end of our options is the prospect of electing our representatives by lottery from the eligible citizenry. Citizens would be selected to serve at random for a stated term or until 51% of registered voters proactively withdrew their support. The lottery system requires that elected officials be treated more like civil service positions. The minimum requirements for office requiring specialized skills would be established by a nominating committee and reviewed periodically for appropriateness to current conditions. For legislative positions, the requirements might include meeting a minimum score on an examination that tests for competency in language use and an understanding of the governmental process. Successful reliance on such a system requires that our schools effectively prepare individuals for citizenship, something that is sorely lacking at present. Critics of the American political system point out the disturbing fact that the president is frequently unable to implement the programs and policies designed by the executive branch because the Congress is controlled by the opposition party. Under the constitutional model that evolved for Britain and has been adopted by many other countries, a prime minister heads the government as the appointed leader of the majority party, or coalition of parties. Hypothetically, one individual might serve as prime minister for decades. For example, Robert Gordon Menzies was Australia's longest serving prime minister. He held the office twice, from 1939 to 1941 and from 1949 to 1966. Altogether, he was prime minister for over 18 years, still the record term for an Australian prime minister. The question is raised, was this a good thing or not? Common to all social democracies, however, is the assumption that power tends to corrupt, and that only a separation of powers provides adequate checks and balances. In the United States, the executive branch of government is not empowered to enact legislation, although the initiation of legislative ideas is considered part of the president's leadership role. Rather, executive agencies have been created to assure the proper implementation of legislation. The pros and cons of the two systems and variations thereof ought to be examined and debated. Common to each system, however, is the question of limited tenure in office for a president or prime minister. A school of legal scholars in the United States, generally described as conservatives, have argued that the courts must, under the state and federal constitutions, apply a narrow, strict constructionist criteria to their determinations of legislative constitutionality. There is, however, an unresolved degree of ambiguity associated with the implied powers language in the federal Constitution of the United States. In response, conservatives suggest the courts must refer to the framers' original intent for guidance. The problem, of course, is that the Constitution as a framework of government arose out of compromise. Philosophical and moral principles espoused by at least some of the framers as essential to the securing of liberty and of equality of opportunity were subverted by the collective strength of interest groups. Other countries with written constitutions may have a similar problem. Or conversely, the language of the Constitution is strong on principle, but the protection of the rights guaranteed in the Constitution is weak or inconsistent. Britain and many other countries function without a formal constitution and are instead governed by legislative will, subjected to the pressures of public opinion and checked by traditional values. For those of us who urge the adoption of changes in governmental structure, our task is to establish by education and persuasive discussion a consensus acceptance of the principles against which any constitution of government, written or informal, ought to be measured for its degree of justice. In summary, the function of government ought to be twofold. First, to protect the health and safety of all citizens, and second, to prevent the formation of monopolies, contrive shortages, and or price fixing among producers. And so we've reached the end of Lesson 12.